August 31, 1944. Northern France. The summer heat hangs over the shattered road network as dust clouds mark the relentless advance of the U.S. Third Army. Maps at Allied headquarters are already outdated by the time they are printed. German units are retreating so fast that entire defensive lines exist only on paper. At the center of this chaos is General George S. Patton, pushing his army eastward at a pace no Allied force has ever sustained before, and raising an urgent question at the highest levels of command. How far is too far when momentum becomes its own weapon? By the end of August, Patton's Third Army has achieved what planners once believed impossible. After the breakout from Normandy during Operation Cobra, his forces have raced across Brittany, liberated key cities, and smashed through German rear areas before the Wehrmacht can form coherent defensive positions. Entire German divisions have dissolved under pressure, surrendering not because they are decisively defeated in battle, but because they are outmaneuvered, cut off, and psychologically overwhelmed. To Patton, this is proof that his core belief is correct. In modern warfare, speed kills more effectively than firepower. But speed has consequences. Every mile gained stretches supply lines thinner, fuel consumption skyrockets, ammunition stocks fluctuate unpredictably, vehicles break down faster than they can be repaired. At SHAEF headquarters, staff officers watch Patton's arrows on the map surge forward and begin to worry that the advance is outrunning the logistical reality that sustains it. For them, the question is no longer whether Patton can advance, but whether he can survive the consequences of doing so. Patton is fully aware of these concerns, and he dismisses them with open contempt. To him, logistics exist to serve operations, not dictate them. He pressures supply officers relentlessly, demands priority access to fuel, and improvises whenever official channels slow him down. When gasoline is scarce, he diverts it. When trucks are unavailable, he requisitions them. When told to wait, he advances anyway. Each success reinforces his confidence and deepens the anxiety of his superiors. At the heart of the tension lies a fundamental disagreement about how the war in Western Europe should be fought. Eisenhower favors a broad front advance, keeping all Allied armies moving forward together to prevent German counterattacks and maintain political balance among Allied commanders. Patton, by contrast, sees opportunity everywhere the enemy is weak, and believes hesitation is a greater danger than overextension. To him, every pause gives the Germans time to regroup, entrench, and recover their will to fight. By early September, this clash of philosophies begins to harden into direct confrontation. Patton's Third Army reaches the Moselle River and probes toward Metz, a fortress city whose defenses date back decades. German resistance stiffens noticeably. Supply shortages become impossible to ignore. Fuel convoys arrive sporadically, forcing armored units to halt while infantry presses on alone. Ammunition allocations are cut back, and artillery fire must be rationed. For the first time since Normandy, momentum slows. Patton responds by pushing harder. He orders attacks across the Moselle despite inadequate bridging equipment and limited fuel reserves. He argues that the enemy is still reeling, and that any delay will allow German forces to stabilize the front. His subordinates, many of whom share his aggressive instincts, execute the orders with determination but growing concern. Casualties rise, coordination becomes more difficult, and local commanders struggle to balance Patton's expectations with battlefield realities. At SHAEF, the reports trigger alarm. Eisenhower and his senior staff see a commander operating at the edge of control, driven by instinct and confidence rather than calculated assessment. They do not doubt Patton's courage or his skill, but they question whether his judgment is being distorted by success. Discussions begin about imposing limits, redirecting supplies, or even temporarily halting the Third Army's advance to restore balance across the front. These conversations are not abstract. The Allies are simultaneously supporting Montgomery's ambitious push in the north and preparing for operations that require enormous logistical investment. Resources are finite, and Patton's demands threaten to disrupt the broader strategy. Every gallon of fuel sent to the Third Army is fuel not available elsewhere. Every risk Patton takes creates vulnerabilities the Germans could exploit if given the chance. Patton senses the shift almost immediately. Messages from higher headquarters become more cautious, more conditional. Requests for fuel are questioned instead of approved automatically. Operational freedom narrows. To Patton, this feels like betrayal at the very moment when victory seems within reach. He argues forcefully that the Germans are collapsing, and that only relentless pressure will prevent them from forming a new defensive line inside Germany itself. What Eisenhower and Patton are really debating is not a single decision, but the nature of command under extreme pressure. How much autonomy can one commander be given before his success becomes a liability? How do you restrain momentum without destroying it? And at what point does boldness cross the line into recklessness? These questions do not have clean answers, and in September 1944 they are being tested in real time, with lives and the outcome of the war hanging in the balance. As the Third Army presses against the Moselle defenses, the friction between Patton's drive and Allied command control reaches its most dangerous point. Orders, counterorders, and compromises begin to shape the next phase of the campaign, revealing just how close Patton came to being stopped, not by the Germans, but by his own side. The struggle along the Moselle exposes limits Patton has rarely been forced to confront. German forces defending Metz are no longer retreating formations in disarray, but cohesive units fighting from prepared positions, supported by fixed fortifications, minefields, and carefully registered artillery. The city itself is ringed by old but formidable forts that dominate river crossings and choke points. Each attempted thrust across the Moselle becomes a grinding fight, measured not in miles gained, but in companies lost and bridges destroyed. Patton refuses to accept the implications. To him, Metz is not a fortress to be reduced methodically, but an obstacle to be bypassed or cracked open through sheer pressure. He orders repeated crossings at multiple points, believing that constant attacks will overload German command and force a collapse. Some crossings succeed briefly, only to be isolated and forced back under heavy fire. Others fail outright as German artillery smashes pontoon bridges before armor can cross. Each setback feeds Patton's anger and deepens his conviction that hesitation, not resistance, is the real enemy. Inside Third Army headquarters, staff officers work around the clock attempting to reconcile Patton's demands with diminishing resources. Fuel arrives in unpredictable trickles. Trucks are worn out. Replacement troops are inexperienced, many fresh from the United States with minimal combat exposure. Medical evacuation routes stretch farther each day, delaying treatment and increasing fatality rates. The human cost of relentless movement becomes impossible to hide behind maps and statistics. Reports flowing upward to SHAEF paint an increasingly complex picture. Patton is still advancing, still engaging the enemy aggressively, but his operations now show signs of strain. Casualties are climbing faster than replacements. Equipment losses exceed repair capacity. Intelligence summaries indicate German forces stiffening along key river lines, buying time for the creation of new defensive belts deeper inside the Reich. Eisenhower reads these assessments with growing unease. The political dimension cannot be ignored. Allied unity is fragile, balanced carefully between American and British interests. Montgomery's northern operations are proceeding slowly but predictably, consuming vast quantities of supplies while offering visible, if incremental, progress. Patton's requests threaten that balance. Granting him priority risks accusations of favoritism and destabilizes coalition cohesion at a moment when unity is essential. Eisenhower begins to act indirectly. Supply allocations are adjusted without formal orders halting Patton's advance. Fuel deliveries are capped. Ammunition shipments are prioritized elsewhere. The effect is immediate. Armored spearheads grind to a halt not because of enemy fire, but because tanks sit idle with empty fuel tanks. Infantry units wait for artillery support that arrives late or not at all. Patton understands exactly what is happening, and it infuriates him. He lashes out at staff meetings, condemning what he sees as bureaucratic cowardice. He writes blistering memoranda arguing that victory is being squandered by timidity. To Patton, this is not simply a disagreement over logistics. It is a moral failure. Every delay means more German civilians and soldiers dying unnecessarily, more Allied troops exposed to prolonged combat, and more opportunity for the enemy to recover. Yet even Patton cannot escape reality indefinitely. As September turns to October, rain transforms roads into mud and rivers into barriers that require careful engineering to cross. The weather compounds logistical problems and slows movement across the entire front. German resistance, though still fragile, becomes more organized. Counterattacks begin to probe Allied flanks, testing overstretched units. The cost of overextension becomes tangible. Within the Third Army, discipline and cohesion remain strong, but exhaustion is evident. Soldiers who have advanced almost continuously since Normandy are worn down physically and mentally. Vehicles break faster than they can be repaired. Officers struggle to maintain tempo while managing casualties and shortages. Patton drives them forward through force of will, but even his energy cannot erase fatigue. At SHAEF, the decision crystallizes. Eisenhower does not publicly reprimand Patton, nor does he remove him from command. Instead, he imposes strategic boundaries. The Third Army is instructed to consolidate, secure supply lines, and reduce fortified positions methodically. The language is careful, diplomatic, but unmistakable. Patton's freedom of action is curtailed. Patton complies outwardly, but inwardly he seethes. To him, the war could have been won faster, cleaner, and at lower cost if momentum had been allowed to run its course. He believes history will vindicate him. Eisenhower, for his part, believes he has prevented a potentially catastrophic overreach that could have exposed Allied forces to counterattack and political fracture. The confrontation leaves lasting marks on both men. Patton learns, reluctantly, that even success has limits imposed by coalition warfare and logistics. Eisenhower learns that brilliance on the battlefield must sometimes be restrained to protect the larger structure of command. Neither fully convinces the other, but both adjust. As the front stabilizes temporarily and preparations begin for the next phase of the war, the question lingers unanswered. If Patton had been allowed to push just a little farther, a little faster, would Germany have collapsed sooner? Or would the Third Army have shattered under the weight of its own momentum? The answer remains buried in the uncertainty of decisions made under pressure, where every choice carries consequences that only history can fully measure. In the weeks that follow, the tension between restraint and aggression becomes institutionalized across the Allied command structure. Orders are now framed with layers of conditional language, designed to channel Patton's energy without allowing it to explode beyond control. Third Army is permitted to advance, but only within increasingly defined logistical parameters. Bridges must be secured before armor moves. Stockpiles must reach minimum thresholds. Coordination with adjacent units becomes mandatory rather than advisory. Patton adapts outwardly, but his instincts do not change. He treats constraints as obstacles to be worked around rather than rules to be obeyed. His staff becomes adept at creative accounting, reclassifying fuel allocations, borrowing from neighboring units, and exploiting ambiguities in orders. This behavior does not go unnoticed. SHAEF intelligence officers and logistics planners begin tracking Third Army movements with heightened scrutiny, measuring not just progress against the enemy, but compliance with command intent. Meanwhile, the German High Command draws its own conclusions from the shifting tempo. The slowing of Patton's advance is interpreted not as exhaustion but as opportunity. German commanders seize the breathing space to rebuild shattered units, integrate Volksgrenadier formations, and establish layered defenses along rivers and urban strongpoints. What Patton had feared most begins to take shape, a front that no longer collapses at the first sign of pressure. Combat during this period reflects that transformation. Engagements become more deliberate and costly. German units fight delaying actions with increasing coordination, withdrawing only after inflicting casualties and forcing the Allies to deploy engineers and artillery to reduce each position. Patton's armored formations, once able to bypass resistance and strike deep, now find themselves drawn into set-piece battles he despises. Inside Third Army, officers debate quietly among themselves. Some agree with Patton that the war has lost its momentum and that victory is being delayed unnecessarily. Others recognize the danger of having advanced so far with such tenuous support. They have seen fuel shortage strand units under fire, watched infantry fight without adequate artillery cover, and counted the losses that result when speed outruns sustainment. The confidence of August has given way to a more sober understanding of limits. Eisenhower monitors these developments carefully. His decision not to stop Patton outright appears vindicated. The Third Army remains aggressive, effective, and dangerous, but no longer threatens to tear free of the Allied operational framework. Coalition unity holds. Supply networks stabilize. Planning horizons extend beyond the next breakthrough to the long, grinding reality of fighting inside Germany itself. Yet the memory of what nearly happened lingers. Staff officers who witnessed Patton's August and September drive understand how close the Allies came to either a decisive collapse of German resistance or a catastrophic overextension. The margin between those outcomes was never wide, and it depended on judgments made under extreme uncertainty, with incomplete information and immense pressure. For Patton, the episode reinforces his belief that history favors the bold, even when institutions resist them. He does not abandon his philosophy, but he refines it. In later operations, he pushes hard at moments of weakness and accepts restraint when resistance hardens. The experience tempers him without extinguishing the aggression that defines his command. As autumn deepens and winter approaches, the war enters a new phase. The Germans are no longer retreating blindly, and the Allies are no longer advancing effortlessly. Both sides prepare for what comes next, shaped by the lessons of a moment when momentum nearly outran control. The question of how far Patton could have gone remains unresolved, not because it lacks an answer, but because war rarely grants the clarity required to prove one path right and another wrong. As October turns toward November, the consequences of those earlier decisions begin to surface in subtle but profound ways. German intelligence, observing the steadier pace of Allied movement, adjusts its own planning assumptions. What had once looked like an unstoppable flood now resembles a heavy, grinding advance that can be delayed, redirected, and occasionally bruised. This shift emboldens German commanders to attempt localized counterattacks, probing for weaknesses created by extended lines and tired units. Patton encounters these probes firsthand. Skirmishes erupt along forest roads and river crossings where German armor and infantry strike suddenly, then withdraw before overwhelming force can be brought to bear. None of these actions threaten to reverse the Allied advance, but they impose friction. Every counterattack demands fuel, ammunition, and time. Each one forces commanders to pause, secure flanks, and commit reserves that Patton would rather keep moving forward. Within Third Army headquarters, planning becomes more complex. The days of drawing long arrows across maps are replaced by dense overlays of supply routes, bridge sites, engineer assets, and artillery coverage. Patton remains deeply involved, walking among his officers, questioning assumptions, demanding alternatives. His impatience is still visible, but it is now tempered by the recognition that the enemy is adapting as well. The weather deteriorates steadily. Rain saturates the ground, turning fields into impassable mud and straining vehicle suspensions beyond their limits. Rivers swell, complicating crossings and magnifying the importance of intact bridges. German demolition teams exploit these conditions ruthlessly, blowing crossings just ahead of advancing units. Each destroyed bridge becomes a focal point of combat and engineering effort, slowing progress and concentrating forces. Eisenhower views these developments with cautious resolve. The crisis of overextension has passed, but the war is far from easy. He recognizes that Patton's earlier drive created opportunities that now must be exploited carefully rather than recklessly. Orders emphasize coordination, logistics, and sustainability. The language of command reflects lessons learned under pressure, shaped by near misses rather than clear victories. Patton, for his part, channels his frustration into preparation. He drills his commanders relentlessly, emphasizing flexibility and initiative within constraints. He demands contingency plans for every operation, alternatives for every delay. The fire that once pushed him to defy limits now fuels his determination to be ready when those limits inevitably shift again. Among the soldiers, perceptions evolve. They still admire Patton's drive and confidence, but they also feel the weight of prolonged combat. Letters home speak of exhaustion as much as triumph. The sense of racing toward an inevitable end gives way to the understanding that the war will demand endurance as well as aggression. Morale remains high, but it is no longer buoyed by speed alone. German resistance stiffens further as winter approaches. Reinforcements drawn from training units and home defense formations fill the gaps. Defensive lines become deeper, more layered. The enemy no longer collapses at the first sign of pressure. Instead, they trade space for time, calculating that time itself has become a weapon. Patton recognizes this shift and resents it, knowing that it validates his fear that hesitation would give the Germans exactly what they need. The memory of nearly being stopped by his own command lingers in Patton's mind. It sharpens his awareness of political realities he cannot ignore. He understands now that victories must be not only decisive but acceptable within the broader Allied framework. Speed remains his creed, but survival within the system becomes an equally necessary skill. As preparations quietly begin for future operations, including contingencies no one yet fully understands, the lessons of late summer and early autumn shape every decision. Patton's drive, Eisenhower's restraint, and the fragile balance between them become defining features of the Allied approach. The war continues not as a sprint, but as a brutal test of judgment under pressure, where every advance carries the memory of how close momentum once came to outrunning control. By early December, the operational picture has settled into an uneasy equilibrium. The Allied front stretches across Western Europe, solid but strained, advancing steadily yet without the explosive breakthroughs that defined the late summer. Patton's Third Army remains one of the most aggressive forces on the line, but it now operates within a framework that demands justification for every major movement. The freedom Patton once enjoyed is replaced by constant negotiation between intent and approval, momentum and permission. Patton senses that something is wrong beyond the visible battlefield. Intelligence reports indicate unusual German movements in the Ardennes sector to the north, an area considered unsuitable for large-scale offensive operations due to its dense forests and poor roads. Many Allied planners dismiss these reports as routine defensive redeployments. Patton does not. He remembers how quickly assumptions collapsed in the past and how often complacency invites disaster. Quietly, he begins to ask questions and request contingency plans. His staff, now conditioned by months of tension between initiative and restraint, responds cautiously. They draft options without pushing them aggressively upward. The Third Army, after all, has already been reined in once. No one wants to provoke another confrontation with SHAEF over hypothetical threats. Yet Patton persists, insisting that readiness is not defiance but responsibility. At Eisenhower's headquarters, attention remains focused on sustaining the advance and managing coalition dynamics. Montgomery's forces continue their methodical progress, while American armies consolidate gains and prepare for winter operations. The prevailing belief is that Germany is nearing collapse and that any remaining resistance will be localized and manageable. The memory of Patton nearly pushing too far still shapes decisions, reinforcing a preference for caution. The Germans exploit this mindset. Behind the front lines, preparations accelerate for a counteroffensive designed to shatter Allied confidence and restore strategic initiative. Fuel, armor, and elite units are concentrated under strict secrecy. The Ardennes, dismissed by many as a quiet sector, becomes the focal point of Germany's final gamble. Time, which Patton has always feared losing, is now being used against the Allies. Within Third Army, Patton's awareness grows sharper. He orders his commanders to maintain flexibility, to keep units mobile despite winter conditions, and to think in terms of rapid redeployment rather than fixed positions. These orders attract little attention at higher headquarters, blending easily into routine preparations. Yet they reflect Patton's enduring belief that the greatest danger lies not in the enemy's strength, but in the failure to anticipate his intentions. The soldiers feel the tension even if they cannot articulate its source. Training intensifies. Inspections become more frequent. Patton's presence at the front increases, his visits marked by urgency rather than spectacle. He speaks less about glory and more about readiness, about the cost of surprise and the value of speed when plans collapse. The earlier struggle over how far Patton could be allowed to push now takes on new meaning. The limits imposed on him have not extinguished his instincts, they have sharpened them. He has learned when to comply, when to prepare quietly, and when to wait for the moment when restraint will no longer be tenable. As winter deepens and the front settles into a deceptive calm, the unresolved question of momentum versus control hangs over every headquarters. Decisions made months earlier echo in the present, shaping how commanders interpret warning signs and allocate resources. The war has entered a phase where the consequences of past choices will soon collide with events no one can fully control, and the balance between caution and speed is about to be tested again under the harshest possible conditions.